So again, this is chapter 4, tissues, part 1. So it turns out there are 4 basic types of tissues in the human body. There is the epithelial tissues, as shown over here on the left. The epithelial tissues line the spaces of the body. Then we have the connective tissues. Connective tissues, a very diverse group that do many functions. We have the muscle tissues. Muscle tissues involved in generating force, allowing for movement in some way or another. And then finally, the nervous tissue making up the brain and spinal cord and carrying electrical signals throughout the body. So we'll start with the epithelium. Epithelial tissues can also be called epithelium. Epithelium is basically sheets of cells covering the inner or outer surfaces of the body. So they could be lining the inside of a hollow organ like the stomach, or it could be the skin, for instance, covering the outside of our body. Functions of epithelium include protection, and so that we don't suffer damage to underlying tissues, absorption, allowing small materials to cross through the epithelium into deeper tissues and maybe eventually the bloodstream. Diffusion, which can be either the movement of materials through the epithelium into the deeper tissues or out of the deeper tissues. And also filtration. Filtration allowing things to pass through but limiting it based on size. It's also worth noting that all glands in the body are made up of epithelial tissue. So glands are made up of epithelial tissue, and glands have one big function, and that is secretion, secreting a variety of substances, including hormones, for instance. So there are 2 main kinds of glands. There's the endocrine glands. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into the surrounding fluids or bloodstream. So over here in this picture, here is the gland. Here's a blood vessel going through the gland, and so it'll be secreting its hormones either directly into the bloodstream or into the surrounding fluids of the tissue. And then exocrine glands, on the other hand, have ducts that lead to a surface. And so exocrine glands secrete substances into the duct that then empty onto the surface. So for instance, sweat onto the surface of our skin, saliva into the surface of our oral cavity, mucus, gastric juice into the stomach, and so on. So things to remember about epithelial tissue. Epithelium, it turns out, has lots and lots of cells. Again, it is made up of sheets of cells. So the primary component is cells. And these cells are connected to each other by specialized cell junctions that hold them together. It's also worth noting that the cells found in epithelium have a polarity. That means they're not identical on all surfaces. The apical surface that faces the open space or lumen, that is distinct from the basal surface. The basal surface connecting to the underlying connective tissue through a structure called the basement membrane. So the basal side, the basal region, connects to the basement membrane that then connects to the underlying connective tissue. The apical surface is open to the open space that the epithelium is lining. It's also important to know that the epithelium tissue always rests on connective tissue. So epithelial tissue is always on top of connective tissue of some kind. The epithelium is avascular. So this means there is no blood vessels running through the epithelial tissue. It is avascular. However, the epithelium is highly innervated. So there are lots of nerve endings connecting to the epithelium. So epithelium can be a very sensuous structure. Our skin, as we know, experiences all kinds of sensations: touch, tickle, itch, temperature, pain, and that's partly because it is innervated, connected to nerves. And finally, epithelium is very regenerative. The epithelium is constantly has its cells dividing and producing new cells. All right, when you want to define epithelium, you can do it by 2 main characteristics: by cell layers, the number of layers to the epithelium, and by cell shape. So when we look at cell layers, we see that if you have just one layer of cells, one sheet of cells, that's called simple. If you have two or more layers of cells, then that is referred to as stratified. And finally, if you have one layer of cells, but the nucleuses are in all kinds of different levels, and it just looks kind of confusing, and you can't tell for sure if it's two layers or not, that's called pseudo-stratified. So one clear layer, simple, one layer that is a little confusing, pseudo-stratified, and two or more layers, stratified. With cell shape, there are three main shapes we look for. The first is the cell flat? Is it wider than it is tall? If it is, then it is called squamous. Squamous are flat cells. Then there's cuboidal. Is it about as wide as it is tall? If so, it is cuboidal. And then finally, columnar. And columnar are taller than they are wide. So columnar cells are much taller than they are wide. It's worth to note that if you're looking at stratified tissue, so what tissue with two or more layers, then you only look at the most superficial layer, the layer directly adjacent to the open space. That's the layer you look at to determine cell shape. So for instance here is simple squamous epithelium. Simple, there's only one layer of cells. Squamous because these cells are nice and flat. They function to allow for rapid movement of molecules into underlying tissue or out of the tissue. An example is the air sacs in lungs. Well, the diffusion, oxygen diffusing into our tissues from the air in the lungs, carbon dioxide diffusing out of the tissues and into the air in the lungs. Simple cuboidal epithelium. Simple cuboidal, cells are as tall as they are wide. There's just one layer. Here's another example here in a ring-shaped. Simple cuboidal epithelium is absorbed in absorption, so it can absorb fluids, for instance, and also can be involved in secretion, can be producing molecules, producing substances that go into the open space. An example where we can find these is in the kidneys. The kidneys have lots of little tiny tubes made up of simple cuboidal epithelium. Then we have simple columnar epithelium. So simple columnar epithelium, we have cells much taller than they are wide, and there's just a single layer. Simple columnar epithelium can be involved in absorption, so lining the small intestines, they will absorb nutrients. Or secretion could be producing substances. For instance, the cell here produces mucus. There are two main categories to simple columnar epithelium. You have non-ciliated. Non-ciliated means there's no cilia. However, the cells often, not always, but often possess what are called microvilli. So microvilli are little protrusions of the apical surface that increase the surface area, which allows for better absorption of nutrients. Non-ciliated often have goblet cells. As I mentioned, here's a goblet cell. There's another one. Goblet cells produce mucus. Mucus is very important for many of our body systems. An example is simple columnar epithelium lines most of the digestive tract, lines the small intestine, large intestine, stomach. Here is a view of those microvilli. So again, the apical surface could have these little protrusions of the plasma membrane, and they look kind of like little fingers or tubes. And again, this increases surface area, so there can be more absorption occurring. The other kind of simple columnar epithelium is ciliated. Ciliated simple columnar epithelium has cilia, little hair-like structures coming off the apical surface, and their job is to beat, and that beating moves materials outside of the cells. Specifically, in this case with the lungs, it is moving mucus. So cilia can move other things, but a big category is mucus. Goblet cells, of course, produce the mucus. The cilia can then move it when we're talking about the respiratory system. And the bronchioles within the lungs are an example of where you can find ciliated simple columnar epithelium. So again, here is cilia. Cilia are much longer structures than the microvilli. They look kind of like little hairs, and they're able to beat, to move. They're motile. And they move materials outside of the cell, for instance, mucus. Then we have pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. Pseudo-stratified is just one layer. but it looks kind of confusing because the nuclei are all up and down in these cell layers. And you can see that there are some cells that go from the bottom to the top, but there's others that you can't tell for sure if they're going to the top and bottom or not. So a little confusing. Pseudostratified, again, is one layer of columnar cells, just somewhat confusing to look at. The non-ciliated form is found in the meliurethra as a structural function. The ciliated version has goblet cells that produce mucus, and the mucus, of course, is moved by the cilia. Places where you can find pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia is within the respiratory system, in the trachea and the bronchi. Moving on to stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified, so many, many layers. When you look at the layers near the surface, near that open space, you see they are very flat, making it squamous. So stratified squamous epithelium helps to protect underlying tissues, protect from abrasion and frictions. So things can rub up against this tissue. You might lose a few cells on the top, but it doesn't matter because you have all these layers to protect. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, all the cells in the tissue are alive. All of the cells have nucleuses, and it's found in places like the oral cavity and the esophagus that experience a lot of friction from the foods we chew up and swallow. Keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, you see that some of the cells near the bottom, the deeper cells, have nuclei. They're alive, but when you get toward the surface, toward the lumen, these cells lose the nucleus and die. So the superficial layers are dead cells, and they are filled basically with the protein keratin. And these keratinized stratified squamous epithelium is only found in the epidermis of the skin. And surprise, we have one more to learn. It is transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium breaks the naming conventions. Here we only say transitional epithelium. It is called this because when it is in a relaxed state, the cells are kind of circular in shape. But when the structure stretches, the cells stretch out and become more squamous. So it transitions from a rounded structure to a flattened structure. And the place where we find transitional epithelium is the urinary system, such as the urinary bladder, so that when it fills with urine, it stretches. So things to look for with epithelial tissue, you want to know there's a free surface somewhere. You want to count how many layers. This one has one, this has many. And then look at the cell's shape near the surface to help you identify that. So here is simple columnar epithelium, here is simple cuboidal epithelium, and here is transitional epithelium. All right, there are junctions that connect cells, tight junctions. Tight junctions are impermeable, so things cannot pass between the cells. This forms a seal, preventing materials from going between cells. So if anything's going to cross through, it has to go through the cells. Those are the tight junctions, sort of like superglue. We have desmosomes. Desmosomes are protein structures that anchor the cells together, very good at resisting forces, sort of holds the cells together, kind of like rivets. So it's able to resist forces and allow the cells to stay together. So, for instance, very important to say in the heart, where we want the tissue to stay together, not get broken apart by the beating of the heart. Then we have gap junctions. Gap junctions form little tunnels between cells, and this allows fluids to pass from one cell to the next. So gap junctions are forming little tunnels, little channels between cells. Again, and that is it. That's where we'll stop with this part of the lecture.